Good day, everyone. My name is Douglas Ogeto from Ludicworks. I'll be leading today's session at BOG, the panel titled the Funding Industry, How Have Things Changed in the New Normal? Today, I have the pleasure of having Ibrahim Patel, Anya Combs, and Bhavanesh Parbo, who we will be discussing about funding and see how things were, and what we would think it will be, in the next coming days, given that this is the new normal. So I'd like to start off the panel. We definitely are in these pandemic times. How has COVID-19 brought a few changes to the way that businesses operate, and how do we believe that this will impact the banking and crowdfunding sectors? So, open panel, I invite to you to take it off. To take it off.
I think generally, Douglas, in terms of COVID-19 and the impact on financing and on how businesses operate, I think there's a greater appreciation on businesses for the power of online. I think it's also forced businesses to rethink who their traditional customers were, especially businesses that had a predominantly retail or physical footprint. I think they're now starting to think beyond their immediate vicinity, and they're looking towards digital customers, customers in parts that they couldn't access before. So, from what we're seeing, I think it's forcing businesses to rethink who their captive audience is, how they reach that audience. It's forcing them to rethink their operating models, the way they view human capital, and also the way they view their assets in the business. So online capability, communications capability, I would say post COVID are probably going to be a lot more highly valued as assets in the business than perhaps they were before.
Quite.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so from the crowdfunding, specifically the Kickstarter perspective, it's really interesting. So I understand this is a games conference, but just to provide a little bit of context for sort of the larger crowdfunding industry, again, coming purely from the Kickstarter perspective here. So we definitely saw a huge dip in traffic right at the beginning of quarantine. We saw about 35% of our traffic and our pledges just died. Understandable, right? In addition to that, the number of projects that were coming in was also significantly lower for specific categories. Now, specifically, the categories that were most affected were categories that sort of provided an in-person experience, right? So theater, dance, art to a certain degree, music. But interestingly, and music actually has done an incredible job of sort of finding like alternative forms of crowdfunding, which has been great. So venues are crowdfunding, making a record in your bedroom is crowdfunding, things like that. But live music is, obviously a little bit more difficult. But subsequently, the opposite side of that, games has actually done incredibly well. I think there's a lot of different reasons as to why that is. But I can say that the games community and the games category on Kickstarter, this is the best April, May, June, July, and I believe August that we've ever seen on record. I don't know if that's necessarily because there are, even though at least here in the States, millions upon millions of people are out of a job. But the other side of that is there are millions and millions of people who have now, because they're not spending money on anything, a little bit more of a disposable income, which provides more of an opportunity for them to spend money on things like creative endeavors. I also think that there is another side to this, which is that, we're always talking about, what are you doing in quarantine? You're working out, maybe. You're watching Netflix, you're watching Hulu, you're watching movies, you're playing games. Games are still a form of escapism to a certain degree and a form of entertainment. And so people are sort of looking to continuously continue to build on that catalog that you have in your home.
I think from our end, and I echo a lot of the sentiment shared by the two speakers. What we are largely seeing for clients in our space is a forcing or rethinking of how business operate and asking questions which businesses typically should have been asking themselves prior to lockdown. management of resources, management of restrained kind of working capital, those sorts of things. And it's forcing issues. It's forcing these businesses to ask these questions of themselves a lot quicker than they typically would have thought. Then just just a slight comment then from a banking point of view. We work for a government-owned DFI, and what's happening internally is a lot of thought around how we allocate scarce resources to these businesses. So I think those are the two big things that I think are top of mind at the moment.
Awesome responses and quite insightful. And maybe Bhavanash, if we could come back to you, we could say coincidentally that this pandemic, as well as new technologies, seem to have coincided at the same time, given that there are new technologies, for example, like IoT, that are aiding, push things, for example, like farming, for example. How do you see increase in some of these new technologies, as well as, maybe previously some of these companies or SMEs that were seeking this kind of funding? What has been approached from your standpoint in terms of funding, as well as new technologies as well, adoptions perhaps?
So I suppose the big thing to add in there is that the typical kind of clients that would walk in through our doors for techie type deals previously were largely tech companies. And I think what we're seeing now, besides a larger amount of flow of IoT types of transactions, is that a lot of companies which previously couldn't or didn't think that tech would enable them to innovate and do business better and whatnot, they are now approaching us. Whether it's in the agro space or tourism and whatnot, it's really forced a mind shift as to how can I get tech to improve my business? How can I get it to allow me to compete a lot better? So I think that's the biggest thing. Besides the volumes, it's companies that previously we would not have seen approach us are now approaching us.
Quite interesting. Any insights from yourself, Patel or Anya?
I think Bhavinash is spot on, and it goes to what the speakers also said to the previous question, is it really is forcing businesses to rethink their business model and to get themselves reacquainted with technology and, really reorient the way they look at the world and what they view as assets and important. And I think that's really great. If I think for myself, Bhavinash, if that's the funding that's coming through, I think that's great because it means that we're going to see those investments in capacity, which hopefully will make those businesses more resilient going forward.
Yeah, and I suppose the big thing which leads off from there is then are our funding models shaping up quickly enough to match these different types of businesses which are walking through the door. But I suppose that's a bit of a thing for later on in the discussion. Huh?
Okay. And I think also if you look at some of these good technologies, we definitely can say there's a bit of spillover. Some of these companies do not necessarily provide the solution themselves. So even if one company does get the funding, they definitely might engage another company, which will then benefit from this. Um, but not everyone might have this opportunity. Some companies are always looking to raise, just a bare amount of money to ensure that proof of concept. So Anya, coming from non-for-profit, maybe if I could use that word, how do you see you guys coming in to assist people with their proof of concept?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I get this question from time to time about how people can use Kickstarter for potentially funding a prototype or a vertical slice. And the answer is it's definitely difficult. I've seen some examples of it happen But at the end of the day, our terms of service basically say that if you say you're coming to Kickstarter to make a thing, you have to make that thing, right? And so if you're coming to Kickstarter just to basically just like raise, let's say $7,000 to make a prototype of something, there's going to be pushback on that. There's going to be a significant amount of pushback on that from the community, because our community essentially has it ingrained that if you are a creator and you come to Kickstarter, and you're using Kickstarter to fund the thing, you have to make the thing, right? That has to be at least like, the first 5 levels of a game or something like that. So funding something as simplistic as, a prototype, while I understand that's not necessarily simplistic, obviously a vertical slice makes it even more difficult. I think coming to Kickstarter to do the first half of the game to sort of test the waters is much better than coming to Kickstarter just to do a prototype, because unfortunately, our community is going to sort of like fight against that a little bit more.
Quite interesting. And how do you think you guys have been able to innovate in terms of criteria? This is probably how you used to view applications as they come in before, and now we live in new times and we have to be a bit flexible. So to the panelists, how have your organizations changed in terms of how you evaluate these applications before you give them the necessary funding?
Well, post-COVID, we haven't changed at all. The only changes that we've made are for anything that's specifically about raising money for donations, and that's always sort of been in place, right? Like, we're not a charity. Charitable organizations can use Kickstarter, but you cannot use Kickstarter to raise money for charity. Additionally, any sort of medical claims we're looking at, like, under even a more sort of like stricter eye, especially like this mask will save your life sort of things. We just don't allow language like that or any sort of projects like that. Masks you can do if you want to run a project that has a mask, that's totally fine. You just have to be really sort of upfront as to sort of what the intent is. But outside of that, we haven't really instated any sort of like additional restrictions or allowances or anything like that.
Okay, thanks for the insights. Bhavanish Patel, any observations from your end?
So I think, Douglas, from my side, I can't speak to my organization's process because I'm not directly involved in that. I think it's fair to say, though, that definitely any organization in most lines of businesses have actually re-looked at certain things, and there's definitely learnings coming out of this. So I would definitely assume that most organizations, especially the financial institutions, would definitely have learned and have tailored their processes. What's interesting to me, though, in this conversation, looking forward, if I look beyond the horizon, perhaps we'll see the day, if I can just leave a thought with the viewers, maybe we'll see the day where the application to an institution, like let's say an IDC, where it's actually that crowd-funded MVP or that crowd-funded finished product that's actually the application criteria to an institution like the IDC. Because the one thing that strikes me for a platform like Kickstarter is, yes, one is you get funding, but more than funding is you get that validation in terms of the crowd. How do ordinary people see this? Is this something that's attractive to people? If enough people see it on Kickstarter, it's probably got a greater chance of success if 1,000 or 2,000 people have backed it, rather than, let's say, 10 people in a credit committee. So I think we still have a way to go, but if I have to look forward and look into my crystal ball, I can see a time where, maybe the application criteria is to say, have you actually crowdfunded the first piece of it? Show us your crowd evidence. Where's the evidence of acceptance by more than X people? Or which of the crowdfunding platforms have you been successful on as your initial criteria for funding? So, that, to my mind, I don't think that happens anywhere yet. But, certainly listening to Anya and you connecting the dots, one could certainly see a future where perhaps, there's no application forms. It's actually the proof of the pudding's in the eating, as they say, and people will come with their funding stats and say, so many people funded me, I've actually built it, they've used it, and these are my credentials for getting finance to scale.
For sure. And given that to bring it back home, we're in the gaming space. The gaming industry has, and maybe to the larger extent, esports has been able to receive quite the positive traction over the last few months. Given that people are locked at home trying to find entertainment. Bavanesh, you guys would be probably considered the traditional, money bags or investors. How would you say that? Would you say you guys are looking to enter into this entertainment and perhaps gaming industry? How have things changed when it comes to looking at this sector?
Sure. So we are already in the in the entertainment space as it is. The IDC has a unit called Media and Audiovisual, which currently funds heavily into content, but traditional content. So that's anything that appears on theatrical or uh, on a streaming platform and those sorts of things. So we are well versed in that space. Well, with regards to what we are looking at doing new, based on what we've seen in the last few months, I think a couple of things are come top of mind. Firstly, is that we'd like to look for more businesses which are able to work in a remote space, particularly in this kind of sector. So the likes of your animators, your gamers, and whatnot, they've displayed a great amount of resilience because of the model that they currently embrace, and it's set up for a scenario for the future that many of us are going to be moving into. So that's it from that end. I think the one interesting thing though that I've seen, particularly in our organization, and it's a rise out of this chaos, is that as much as we are working with like constrained resources and those sorts of challenges with regards to allocations of capital and what have you, there's still a great amount of acceptance of saying if there are interesting ideas out there, let's have a look at them. If there's something really disruptive, if there's something really innovative, um, now's the time to start looking at them, because it's quite clear that there are things which are not so normal out there in the likes of your esports and what have you, which are gaining traction. Um, and it's important for us to be looking at these.
Cool. Thanks so much. And for those ones who perhaps have raised or raised through you, do you usually provide follow-on funding? What are some of the expectations that startups or young companies should think of when they approach you?
Sorry, was that directed at myself?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I missed the question. Sorry, Douglas.
Okay. So sorry, I was saying, usually for a company that is trying to raise funding, it's usually a journey, whether early stage or seed stage, and also looking for follow-on funding. So just curious for myself as well as anyone who will be listening, what's the typical journey for anyone who is able to raise investment from your firm?
So look, I'll just give a high level kind of thing, because different businesses require or have different journeys. The IDC funds are along a very large continuum, from startups through to large scale builds. So these would have different kinds of journeys internally, but typically it would involve an inquiry with one of our transactors or deal makers, just to see whether or not there's appetite for us. There would be an internal discussion within a team to see whether or not there's a mandate fit, and there's an appetite fit. The usual kind of DD thereafter, and taking a deal to a credit com to approve, and signing of legals and those sorts of things thereafter. That's more or less it from a process kind of view. And I don't want to run into timelines and those sorts of things again, because those are pretty case specific.
Okay, thanks so much. Ibrahim, in terms of the industry as a whole, would you say that companies are asking for funding in order to survive or sustain their operation during this economic hardship?
So Douglas, I think it's pretty clear that given what we've gone through and are still going through, a lot of the funding requests would have a survival bias to it. I think that's to be expected. But if I listen to what Bhabanesh is saying, and I also think through the various discussions I've had with various companies in the course of the work that I do, clearly there's also a look to what's happening beyond the horizon. So I think there's also this appreciation that while there's been quite a seismic shift in the way companies operate and that they've been disrupted by the lockdown and the virus, etc., I think there's also a realization that there's also an opportunity to build off a base. And the survival mindset isn't just let me see this through and hope that I can see the next one and the next one and the next one. It's a bit different this time because it's almost let me see this through because I know that if I can, there's great opportunity at the end. And I think that to me has been the difference in mindset. It's not like, okay, I'm now in crisis number 3 of 10 that I'm expecting during the life of my business. It's actually, I want to survive this, not so that I can live to fight another day. I actually want to survive this because I know I want to be part of what's waiting on the other side. So it's actually strange sometimes because there's this optimism that is also accompanied with a very dire situation in the here and now. So I think you're spot on. Definitely survival and making it through to a stable position is top of mind. But I think if we look beyond the immediate use of the funding and we go into the types of conversations that we're hearing, I think there's a very positive mindset behind trying to survive. It's not trying to survive for survival's sake. I think a lot of the sharp entrepreneurs are actually wanting to survive and get through this because they see genuine value on the other side of the tunnel. That's just a difference that I've picked up in what I've read and the people that I've spoken to.
Thanks so much. Usually when you look at the person, who has the money, different people invest for different reasons, either for passion or impact, etc. Anya, given that some of the people who fund through your platform, initially might have been funding because they love what they see. But given the situation, they also, you might have a change of heart or for whatever reason. Would you say that some of your backers are are backing over from board games to computer games based on the gaming revenues growth that was reported this year, as well as some of the social challenges? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would have to look into the data specifically as to see like if digital games are increasing in terms of revenue. I can say that our success rate in video games this year has increased pretty significantly. Site-wide for the last 11 years, the success rate is about 22%. This year in 2020, it's at about 28%. I would also say that there are 4 separate video games that have all made over $1 million US. That's pretty impressive considering I believe last year we only had 2, and all 4 of those have been within the time frame. I'm sorry, except for the first one, I believe, but definitely the last 3 have been within the time frame of when the pandemic first hit. So it's safe to say, like I want to anecdotally say that the answer is yes, but I would obviously want to have a little bit more concrete data there just to kind of confirm that.
Quite interesting. We should definitely motivate more video game developers to come onto your platform.
I
Given the
agree.
success. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge that we face, mostly because there's a lot of misinformation out there about what funding on Kickstarter actually is and what ends up really happening in that space. Which is why I'm trying to do more of these talks, is to be like, no, just come talk to me. I'm happy to dispel some of these crazy rumors that we hear.
Thanks so much. So I think I'll open the floor to everyone. You all have your experiences, you all have your insights. Whether in gaming or whether in the industry as a whole, what do you think moving forward and given the new normal that companies should be able to do in order to survive as well as to scale even post whether this is a year down the line, at least just to ensure that they keep growing. Anyone? Any takers?
I'll take it, Douglas. So I think from my side, when I look at it, there's obviously a lot of things that companies can and should do and probably will. I'll just speak about 1 or 2 that have really stood out for me. And one, I think, is establishing a real community and sense of community and rapport with your customers, and understanding that your customer community and your stakeholder community goes beyond what you previously saw. So I think, and that hints to the digitization, it hints to online, it hints to remote working, it hints to decentralization. Is I think companies will now start to focus a lot more on building that customer community and on building relationships with their customers, employees, shareholders, etc. But relationships built on data, on real-time feedback, relationships built on technology rather than physical location or on transactions. And I think it'll be a lot more symbiotic, where I think people in the community around the company will have expectations of the company in terms of ethical, moral behavior. As a way of example, and the company itself will also look to its crowd, possibly for funding, for feedback, etc. So, we spoke about Kickstarter and what a lovely model that is for a sort of proof of concept, and that could one day be the actual application for the loan. And I think smart companies will realize that as they look to innovate and expand their product lines, they can actually tap the communities that they've built around them for a similar type of feedback. And I think we'll also see a lot more of a blurring of lines between a customer purely as a consumer to a customer as an advisor, as someone that can have input into strategy, and also as a funder. So, things like pre-funding, crowdfunding from your customer base, feedback loops with customers where customers inform your strategy, etc. I think for me, there's many, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will come up with some really good insights. But if I had to just choose one, for me, I think companies going forward will really look at something that perhaps they've taken for granted or had a one-dimensional relationship with, and that's their customer and stakeholder community around them.
Yeah, I completely agree here, especially on the note of being sort of like an ethical company. I think, one of the challenges here is looking at this from like a purely global standpoint, right? Where like each country and each continent is slightly different, some more than others. But that's a huge thing that we've been talking about in the US. And I would say that, in addition to not just COVID, but also, again, keeping a US centric mindset here, also with just the social justice and the social unrest that's currently happening, the desire and need for ethical consumption and ethical companies is like stronger than I think it truly has ever been. So moving forward, I think there's a level of just like, I understand needing shareholders and profits and revenue and all of the business standpoints of things. But I just think that there is a common or an even ground here, right? Because if you are cutting 50% of your workforce, and yet the people that make the most amount of money are continuing to receive pay raises, I don't really understand where the ethical standpoint of that is, right? So I think a lot of that needs to change, and I think that sort of ends up trickling down. Not that I believe in trickle-down economics, but I think there's a bit of a trickle-down effect there too. I also think that being more reliant on technology, especially from like, I'm thinking specifically for board games. Obviously, board game cafes and spaces where you have to physically play games with people, where that requires now a level of sanitation that we maybe didn't have before, which like we probably should have had the entire time. Conversation for another day. But migrating to a digital format for sorry, that was my computer. But migrating to a digital format for just purchasing board games, for example, I think is definitely like a huge thing that companies need to just consistently sort of migrate towards.
Cool. So I think for me, I'd like to take this time to thank Jordan Crossley from the Business of Gaming for making this panel possible. I think we're moving into new times. We definitely need to adopt as well as release strategies that haven't worked before. I think my key takeaways from this session are definitely, we should keep building relationships, identify diverse options, channels, for example, Kickstarter, and as well also looking at the funding team, like from Bhavanish, just to ensure that as a startup, you just keep innovating, become flexible. So I'd like to thank the panelists, Ibrahim, Anya, and Bhavanish. Thanks for sharing your insights today, and I do hope that this information will go a long way to supporting any gaming company or any startup out there that is looking to definitely grow, scale, and seek funding. So I've been your host, Douglas Ogeto. It's been a pleasure, and do enjoy the rest of the Business of Gaming forum. Thank you.